And we are live. Okay. Hello, everybody. As somebody who works on Genesis almost day in, day out, there is one website that I have open in my browser all the time. And that is not my website. That is Genesis Visual Hooks Guide. So we're going to meet and hear the person who has created that. Chris, please take it over.
Hey, yeah, so my name's Christopher Cochran. I am the creator of genesistutorials.com/visual hook guide. It's an awesome tool to use if you're getting into Genesis, or even if you're a seasoned veteran in Genesis. With over hundreds of hooks within Genesis, it's hard to remember them all, and it's always great just to have there available. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Genesis hooks. Earlier, yesterday or earlier in the day, depending where in the world you are, Joe gave a fantastic talk on hooks already. I'm going to go a little bit over hooks again, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of my favorite hooks and just a more overview of actual hooks and how they work. So I'm just going to pull up some slides here. And let's see, hopefully that works. Let me just actually entire screen share. All right. So yeah, get hooked. Understanding Genesis hooks. Genesis has a lot of great features that will get you hooked really quick. From its lightweight, simple, but effective markup, its great support, and even some of the great child themes from StudioPress and third-party themes. But really what gets me hooked are, well, you know, the hooks. This also could be what scares a lot of people away from Genesis, though, because it is a lot more code based to make modifications. But the also beauty of it is, if you can understand this, you can really take Genesis far. But the way Genesis is built, if you're just doing CSS modifications, you can make a lot of these great child themes look outstanding. But really, to bring it to the next level, you really need to start getting into the code and understanding some of these hooks. So what is a hook? Hooks aren't just specific to Genesis. WordPress core uses them extensively as well. But it's really the combination with WordPress and Genesis and the extensibility and the freedom that is granted with, you know, these hooks in Genesis and WordPress that really makes Genesis so powerful. Hooks allow you to change the default functionality within Genesis and allow you to add your own functionality without modifying the core code of Genesis. I'm sure if you've ever downloaded Genesis and went to modify one of the files, you notice that it's structured very differently from any other theme. And most of the template files within core Genesis have a giant banner at the top of the page that say, "Do not edit." Because you really want to interact with Genesis, with child themes, and with the system they have placed with the hooks. You know, they make it really simple to really change anything without modifying code, so you can still get those core updates to Genesis without having to worry about, you know, anything breaking for the most part. So with hooks, there's actually two types of hooks. One hook is the action hook. Within Genesis, there's over 70 action hooks. Most of them are specifically for the front end. You can find a hook in the Genesis code by looking for do action or do action ref array. There's only one of those within Genesis. I forget exactly what it's specifically to, but mostly it's just do action. So action hooks are basically spots within the code where you can execute your own code anywhere. In the Genesis code where you see a do action, it means right at that point you can inject something. So to use it, you use this function here, add action. The first argument of this is the hook. So this would be the name of the hook, like Genesis before. Function would be the custom function name that you create. Make sure you prefix these if you have a same function that already exists, anywhere within your WordPress install. It can be within a WordPress plugin. It could be within Genesis. It can be in, you know, another plugin that you're using. If it uses the same name, it will break your site. You'll probably see like a white screen when you reload your page. So make sure you're using very unique names and prefix it with either your name or your site name. Priority is a number-based system. Lower number, the earlier your hook, your function will be fired within that hook. The higher the number, the later. So with action hooks, because it's actually injecting into the code and into the site, the earlier the number, the earlier your code would appear before anything else that is outputted on the page. So if you want to put something before, say, the title on a single page, you want to set a lower priority so you have your what you want to output before the title. Or if you want it afterwards, you can put a little bit higher. By default, most functions are added at 10 and then just loaded in a cascading order. And then args are basically, you can set a number of the args available. Depending on that number that you set in there, how many args you can pull from. This could have, you know, extra data, for example, like the post ID or anything like that within there that you can then use to add extra information into whatever you're adding onto the page. So some types of action hooks that we have on the front end is the document head hooks. So you have Genesis doc type, Genesis title, Genesis meta. These are all within the head of the site. So if you're looking on the front end, you actually wouldn't see this because it's within the document that is kind of not visible. And this is more for other systems to kind of read, like your browser could understand what's on the page and things like that, or even add like Facebook tags or extra metadata that other tools may need to properly read your site. Then there's a bunch of structural. What I have listed on this slide right here is only the hooks in a header of the page. So like the very top of the page. You have a before, you have the actual header, which actually a couple other functions, core functions within Genesis hook to. And Genesis header right, which the header right widgets are hooked into. Genesis site title, which the actual site title is hooked to, the description, where the description is hooked to, and Genesis after header. And you can actually hook into any of these and add your own functions. You can also go in and remove a function that may already be hooked to it by using remove action. Then there's also a couple of admin hooks. So, I mean, a lot of people talk about Genesis and all the front hooks. And actually, my visual plugin only displays the front end hooks as well. But there's actually a bunch, and these are just two that I've used before in the past that are available within Genesis for the back end. So on the settings page for Genesis, you can actually add your own little banner box before the meta boxes or even after the meta boxes. So this could be something useful like contact information if you're a developer and you want to make your client be able to access you. They can just easily go to their Genesis thing. You can have their own information or information about the theme itself. So these hooks are available for that. The other type of hook is filter hooks. So filter hooks modify existing data. And you can find these in the code by looking for apply filters. So it's very similar to how you would add an action hook. It would just be add filter with the hook that you're wanting to hook into, the custom function that you're creating, the priority you want to set, and args. And priority and args aren't mandatory. Same with add action. If you don't add this, the default priority is 10, and just no arguments or no extra data would be pulled in with the filter. But also with the priority in filter hooks, because filters are modifying data, they could overwrite each other, because now you're not just injecting into a spot on the page, you're actually modifying data. So if two filters are hooked into the same tag, same hook, then the one with the lower priority is actually executed first. So then the higher one is actually executed last. So that has the final say. So if you're filtering on some sort of text or an option or any sort of data, and you definitely want to make sure that your filter doesn't get overwritten, set a higher priority. So there's a couple of filters available on the front end. Some of the filters are Genesis get image default args, which is actually a really cool one that I've used a few times in the past. It's probably like a little lesser used one, but when you do have a use case for it, it could be really cool. So what Genesis get image default args does, the filter, actually allows you to filter well, the default arguments for Genesis get image. So there's the post ID, the format, if it's like HTML or just link. You could set the size, the attributes, the fallback. By default, Genesis get image falls back to the first image available in a post. So you can actually either set that off with this filter or set in your own specific image ID, which then you can load a specific placeholder for any posts that don't have an image for, for the featured image where Genesis uses Genesis get image. And there's also other filters within Genesis get image other than just the Genesis get image default args. There's even a filter for actually completely short-circuiting the function, where you stop it from doing whatever it does in core Genesis, and you can actually completely override the function with your own logic and functionality. Or you can use Genesis pre-get image, which will have all the data that Genesis get image that's set up already, and then you can use that to just kind of create your own output for Genesis get image. The other filter on here is Genesis attribute underscore the context. So what those brackets mean, and if you see this in the code when you're looking for apply filters, what it means is this is actually a placeholder. So if you're actually using this, it wouldn't be the brackets with the $ context. It would be like Genesis attribute, content, I believe. I'm forgetting them off the top of my head, but we can dive into the code later, and we can kind of see how some of these work. But what's great about this is you can actually add, IDs to specific elements that may not by default have an ID within Genesis. There's not, like, I try and stay away from using IDs really in markup, but sometimes some things may just require it for whatever reason. But what I find it more useful for is adding like custom attributes for jQuery or even Angular. So you can add that directly to the element without actually having to modify any core Genesis or unhooking a complete section just to add a specific attribute that you may need called. Then there's some backend filters. Some backend filters are Genesis theme settings defaults. I actually love this filter. I've used it many times. I've used it in some larger projects that there's multiple sites that I need to set up, and they're all sharing the same exact theme settings. So then I don't have to go into each individual site and update the settings on a site-per-site basis. I can just add this function and the filter to my theme and have that run that one time. It'll set all the default theme settings, and I don't have to go back through. Actually, let me see. I believe I have it open. Theme settings. Oops. So these are some of the available options within Genesis. Actually, these are all of the available options within the Gene theme settings default. You can see update, update email. And what this is relating to is, if I go into Genesis theme settings, so it's this page. So that very first option that you see is the update checkbox here. And these are the default values. So by default, that is set to 1. And the notify email is set to 0. So you can have a network of sites maybe, and all the sites you want to have by default, breadcrumbs set on post or pages. So you can just go into here and filter it like this. So like here is just a sample piece of code where I've set the breadcrumb single. I want to always have that on. Content archive thumbnail to 1, so that all the content archives always have a thumbnail. The post nav to use the preview and next instead of the numeric values. And you can also even store the header scripts and footer data in here. What is even great too is instead of just for the initial setup, say you have a client and they love to click on stuff. I'm sure we all had clients that love to click on everything in the site. You could lock everything down, but sometimes you still do want your client to have some control. It's late at night, they're clicking, they just accidentally destroyed their archive pages, removing all the thumbnails. The page now looks a mess, they're freaking out. Well, you set up your default options inside the theme. So now all they need to do is just come to this page and they can easily hit the reset settings. And what this filter actually does is set all the default values. So when they hit reset settings, whatever you've set in the theme code will switch back to that. So then their site is set up exactly as you set it up and handed it over to them. So if they clicked on something they didn't know or changed some settings that they didn't want to, or with some of these bigger header and footer scripts, you have a couple of custom scripts in here for Google or any other type of tracking code, they can get it right back by just hitting the reset default settings. So that's actually a really cool one. The other one is Genesis load deprecated. So with every new version of Genesis, Genesis normally will deprecate a function. So these deprecated functions are dropped into a file, and they're still loaded just with a deprecated notice. It's a small performance hit. It's nothing major, but if you want to push every bit of performance, every bit of second counts, you can actually just set Genesis load deprecated to false using one of the core WordPress return false functions right here. And this will basically just prevent that file being loaded, so you're not loading all these deprecated functions. Especially if you're building on a newer version of Genesis, you shouldn't be using any of the old deprecated functions anyways. So you can set this in your theme, and it won't load any of them. And then, yeah, so don't be scared of Genesis hooks. This was just a really brief overlook. I know there's some questions in the polls, so I'm going to get to that. But yeah, don't be scared, get hooked. Definitely check out Joe's talk from earlier too. She goes over a lot of actually how to use the hooks and how to filter content, how to add actions. There's really a lot of things you can do within Genesis with its actions hooks and filter hooks. And when I first started with Genesis, it was a whole new concept. But because I also use filters and hooks within core WordPress, it was kind of familiar to me. But if you're not familiar with that and you're starting with filters and hooks, Genesis is actually a great place to start. There's a great community as well with WordPress. But it's a little bit clearer of what these hooks do. And then you can really dive back into core WordPress and really start, taking control of your sites with a combination of the WordPress hooks and filters and Genesis hooks and filters. So yeah, that is my presentation. I'm gonna switch back to hold on here. How do I do this? Hello. So I'm gonna switch back into the chat room here just so I can see what was going on. There's a one. Oh, hello.
Hey, so I'm not sure whether you're able to see the questions, but the top question at the moment is, how many action and filter hooks are there in Genesis?
So action hooks, I know there's about 75, I believe. I ran a count earlier. And filter hooks, core Genesis filter hooks, there might be around 70 as well. It was a little bit harder to get a quick number count just because Genesis is also using apply filters and things from core WordPress. But there's quite a bit. You really could filter a lot of things, and even in the 2.2 version coming out, there's actually a few more available filters and action hooks that are being added. So that number is just going to keep growing.
Great. So Ada Rojas, she asks whether you can do an example of repositioning the footer using footer markup open and footer markup close hooks.
Yeah, definitely. So if you watched Joe's talk earlier, she talked about the plugin I actually used. I have it installed on my dev environment here. It's called the Genesis Visual Hook Guide, and what it actually does is, so I have it activated here right now. I'll just go to the plugins. So you would activate this plugin. Once the plugin is activated, you go to the front end, and you can kind of see this would be added to your admin bar. So you have add action hooks. Picking on this, I can then see all my hooks. So the footer is down here, Genesis footer. And this is actually a function hooked into Genesis footer. The way you can even get to this is if you search Genesis core code, or you can just go to Studio Press. Studio Press, oops, has great guides on a lot of the hooks and a lot of the core functions that are already hooked into a lot of hooks. If you go into the My Studio Press, you do need to have an active license to be able to access this area. But
okay, great. Now, can you just let us know if there is any performance overhead by using the plugin versus just referring to the Visual Hooks Guide web page?
So the plugin, I mostly use the plugin just for local development, just to kind of have it available. Actually, honestly, to be honest, I actually really use it. I just use the website, and I actually took screenshots of the site to kind of just have a piece of paper that I printed out. But every now and then, the bonus of having this is if you're working with something that may have switched some things around, or you can't easily see the load order. Maybe they moved the header up into Genesis before. You can kind of see exactly where things are loading on your actual site, which is a plus. When you aren't using any of these, the code is actually not loaded on your site either. So there's really nothing if you even leave it active on your site. But I would just deactivate it when you're not using it. Because anyone could just add this in and get access to the hooks. So it could just look ugly if somehow it gets cached.
Okay. Is it possible for you to share your screen and just go through the footer, how to make changes in the footer? Because you were not sharing the screen.
Yeah, you know what? I just realized that. Okay, hold on 1 second. Let me just... Genesis.can. Yeah, so let's load up. Let me share my screen. Entire screen. All right. Okay. So here's my local install. Yeah, it's just the default Genesis sample theme. If I scroll down to the bottom of the site, you can kind of see the footer down here. Um, so could you do an example of the use of a hook and the different elements that are needed, for example? So say I want to reposition this footer or add some extra code into the footer. Um, if I use this plugin, I can kind of see right here that we have Genesis footer, which is actually where the footer is hooked into, Genesis after footer, Genesis after. If I want to actually find the function for this, I can go to studiopress.com, or I could just open up um, the the actual oops, site. Uh, see. See. Sorry, I just had this open too, and I thought I was sharing my screen. Vagrant local. Hmm. 1 second here. Press Trump. Doing it live. That's always the problem, doing things live. Okay, so let me share back my screen. All right, so if I'm sharing my screen now, and I go into here. So I know this is Genesis, so I can go into the Genesis theme here. Now I'm looking for the footer. I'm going in here like I know nothing about Genesis. So I go to footer.php. I now see, warning, this file is a part of, Genesis core framework. Don't edit this. So now looking at this, I'm like, okay, there's just a bunch of do actions. There's a do action Genesis before footer, Genesis footer, Genesis after footer. This isn't really telling me anything. Now I would do a search kind of to find what is actually using this Genesis footer hook. So I could do a whole file search within Genesis for Genesis footer. And wait, let me just make, I think that was wrong, underscore, right? Yeah, Genesis underscore footer. And I find all. This will find any mention of Genesis footer within the theme. So here's it being used in footer.php. It's used a few times in deprecated functions. When Genesis was first released, every do action was hooked to its own function. So that just changed. So you actually see this probably pop up a lot, and that's why there is a lot of stuff in here as well. Now I see this footer.php. So if I start looking through this file, you can see short codes for the footer, and this is actually all part of footer.php shortcode. And now here, before footer, and we're looking for the actual footer. So right here is Genesis footer, and we have a Genesis footer markup open. It has a priority set of 5. If you want to remove an action that already has a set priority, you also have to set the priority when you're removing that hook. So this would be remove action hook. I'll put it there. We also have the markup close, which is set at 15. And then we have the actual footer here, hooked Genesis do footer. So what this would look like going into our code. So we have the one Genesis footer. We're going to remove we're gonna also remove and we're gonna remove Genesis footer markup close. And that was set at a priority of 15. So if I reset the page, reload the page,
Oops.
comma. Reset, reload the page. You can now see nothing is be loaded into this area. For some reason, I don't know, Google just said we don't want footer markup in the footer anymore. We want the footer at the top of the page. The client just sent me an email. They want this done immediately. So I'm like, okay, you know what? They want it at the top of the page. I look at the top of the page. You know what? We have this Genesis before. It's definitely going to load first. I want the footer to load up there. So let's do it. Oops. So I go in there, and then I change this to an add action. And then refresh the page. Now I have the footer at the top of the page. My client's happy, and Google's going to love my site. I'm getting all that new Google juice of, you know, all this links and footer right at the top of the page. That's not a practical use, but you can kind of see how you can go through core Genesis, kind of find the hook that you want, where it is, and then, you know, using add actions, remove actions, change the layout of your site. Yeah.
Okay, great. So do you have any future plans to improve the plugin?
Yeah, actually, I have an update coming with 2.2 because there are a few new filter hooks added. And I actually mentioned during the presentation that there's a couple of admin filter hooks and action hooks, and I'm actually going to start adding those to the plugin as well. So you can kind of browse the back end of Genesis and see what is available to be edited and how. The other great thing about the plugin too is if you look into the code, because it is a public open source plugin, you can already kind of just copy and paste, you know, what was created just to get that output, because the plugin is created just using all the filters and all the filters and all the action hooks to output what is there. So.
Okay. Can you just briefly tell us about how you went about creating the visual, you know, the layout of the website, the visual hook guide? Is it machine generated? How did you do that?
To be honest, when I first started with WordPress for a while, and before Genesis, I was using a couple of like Revolution themes and things like that, but a lot of clients came to me with thesis projects. And at the time, there was a great guide, actually, very similar to the style of this, that was for thesis. And when I started with Genesis in early beta, I wanted something similar. So I went through all of Genesis code and during beta, really just added, you know, everything I could just to kind of see what it looked like, styled it up, and I just used it as a personal tool. After a while, I created a few screenshots. I put them up on an old website of mine, and you know, it actually gained quite popular traction. But the beauty of it, I realized, is what I had is I could easily just copy and paste the text, and I didn't have to type. So I figured I'll release an actual site, and that's when I created Genesis tutorials, mostly just to push out the Genesis visual guide. Genesis tutorials and Genesis the visual hook guide are both getting an update. Genesis tutorials actually is in the process. That's why the site looks a little weird, but both of them are getting a pretty big revamp very soon. So.
Awesome, awesome. Okay. I remember that when I was new to Genesis, which was about 2 years ago, I started using the plugin because I was not sure what actions and filters were. And it really gave me a good head start on getting and understanding how Genesis works and how to make changes. But one thing that I've noticed when I last used the plugin, which was about a year back, was that it was leaving some unused markup. Even if I have not used, even if I have not placed any code in a particular hook, the output was still appearing, blank output. I'm not sure whether I actually reported it to you and then you had a chance to fix it, but just wanted to let you know that.
Yeah, that actually came to my attention around this. I think you actually posted it on Twitter, and I put in a fix that basically wouldn't load any of that markup unless someone's actually filtering it. But again, too, like I said, the plugin really should only be used in development. There's really no issues if you're using it in production, but it's just extra bloat to your site that you don't really need because it's really just something, it's a development tool. It's not meant to be left on the site. It's to be used to kind of, get the head start, know where you're adding code, and then, get rid of it.
Okay. So can you please let us know as to what is the best place to request for features or report missing things about the plugin or your guide?
So I actually not recently, it's been a while now, but I uploaded the plugin to GitHub. My GitHub tag is Christopher Cochran, and you can find the plugin in there, Genesis Visual Hook Guide. There's a few tasks in there now. I'm going to start pushing back to the repo and really start working on it. So I would love, issues, suggestions, and anything. Yeah.
Great. So can you, for the benefit of users, give your Twitter link and your website link in the chat, if you can?
Yep. Oh, no. And then I'm also going to post a link to the
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Oh, yeah, you mentioned your Twitter ID. Great. Now, one last question before we let you go. What are the changes when it comes to hooks and filters in the upcoming Genesis 2.2?
So, you're putting me on the spot here off the top of my head. I know there's a lot of accessibility being added, so there's a lot of filters that kind of revolve around some of the new accessibility features. Also, it seems that there was a lot of cleanup and things like that. Also, I'm just starting to get confused of what is 2.2, and I have to look at the actual comments because there has been just times like I recently realized that there's a filter for the 404 page, so you can actually just filter out the content. I never really figured to look because most of the times when I'm creating a 404 page, I just create a custom template. But there's actually a filter for the title and the content. I believe that was added in 2.0. 2.2 sees a couple of custom post type archive new filters, as well as some new setting hooks, I believe. I'll have to double check, but yeah. There'll be quite a few, and I'll be updating the plugin with a few, with the whole change log, so you'll be able to see all of them.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you so much for spending your time and sharing your wisdom with all of us. As I said at the beginning of the talk, Visual Hook Guide is something that I have open all the time in my browser. So it's really handy, great tool, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Yeah, bye.